Good afternoon and welcome to Chester Beatty's first virtual lunchtime lecture. My name is Laura Muldowney and I am the curator of Chester Beatty's Siam exhibition. Today I would like to welcome my colleague Jon Riordan, who will be talking to us about John Thomson's fantastic photographs of Siam and the historical context in which they were made. John has worked as a photographer for many years, as a photojournalist of modern day South Africa, as a digital photographer of museum collections, and as a teacher of documentary photography. In 2017, John joined the Chester Beatty staff as a digital photographer, and he has been responsible for the last few years for digitizing the museum's remarkable collections. Before we begin, I'd like to point out the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to ask a question, you simply click on the Q&A tab and type your question to either John or me in the box that you see that comes up. At the end of John's talk, we'll answer your questions then. So John, thanks very much for preparing this talk for us. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm sure our virtual listeners are as well. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. Let me just get into the slideshow. Perfect. Hi, everyone. I'm Jon Riordan. As Laura said, I'm one of the photographers in the digital department at the Chester Beatty. I was incredibly flattered when Justina, our education officer, asked if I wanted to give a lunchtime talk about the fascinating Siam through the lens of John Thomson exhibition that we're currently showing. Of course, this was in a different time when things like lecture halls still existed. So please bear with us if this new digital venue is a bit haphazard. That said, I'd also like to thank you all for joining us today and giving our new webinar a try. To start with, I need to say that I love this exhibition. On a practical level, I think that the prints are absolutely fascinating, but that they're also quite awe-inspiring in their size and the clarity and their clarity. I also think that the gallery space and the accompanying design really add to the decidedly modern feel that the prints have. So I must give my congratulations to Laura Muldowney, the curator responsible for that, and my thanks to the Willcox collection, who loaned us the prints for this exhibition. John Thomson's work has been the focus of a number of international exhibitions since 2013, after the curator Betty Yao, MBE, stumbled upon his collection at the Willcox Library. Due to this, a lot has been written about John Thomson himself, and deservedly so. I think he's a fascinating photographer. And because of this, I'm not going to be talking about John Thomson directly, but instead I'd like to tease out some of the context surrounding both the creation of his images and how we view them today. To do this, I'm going to take you on a brief journey through the history of photography leading up to the creation of these images. And on this journey, we will touch on the development of photographic technology and how this led to the development of photography as an art form. We'll also need to explore the photographers that preceded Thomson and how their work influenced the context that he worked within. And finally, we'll look at how his work has been displayed within these modern exhibitions and how this might change how we interpret his works. So, to start with, I'd like to open a bit of a can of worms and ask where, when, and by who was photography invented? When I was studying photography, I was taught that William Fox Talbot invented photography in 1841 when he announced the Calotype to the world. Yet I'd like to expand this idea slightly. Talbot did indeed develop the photographic technology that allowed photography to evolve into what we have today. But it is important to know that he was not alone in working in this field. He was preceded by more than a decade by Josef Nietzsche, a talented French inventor who succeeded in creating the oldest surviving product of the photographic process. This is an example of it, and he was the first person to successfully fix light onto a surface when he captured the view of from a window in his house on a sheet of bitumen-coated pewter in 1826. It doesn't look like much there. That is the original piece of pewter. It's housed in the University of Texas in Austin. But it was scanned, and with some digital magic, they were able to actually enhance the image. And this is essentially what was taken. You can see that there are buildings and there's a tree in the distance. And I find that quite fascinating. What was even more interesting to me is that some modern research was done, and it was concluded that the image might have taken several days to expose. Quite different to what we have experiences with today. So after developing that, Nietzsche went into partnership with a man named Louie de Guerre, this dapper gentleman over here. The pair worked together in the pursuit of a more effective photographic technique until Nietzsche's death in 1833. According to de Guerre, Nietzsche's death affected him so greatly that he almost stopped working on the project. But after a brief hiatus, he returned to it, and in 1939, de Guerre revealed the eponymously named daguerreotype. It has been argued that this was de Guerre taking full responsibility for the work of both men. And while there is some truth in this, it must be said that de Guerre's final process was sufficiently more advanced to be classed as a different technology. Most notably, the speed at which exposure could be achieved was drastically reduced. This is a quote taken from de Guerre's marketing brochure for the daguerreotype. In order to obtain a perfect image of nature, only 3 to 30 minutes at the most are necessary according to the season in which one operates and the degree of intensity of the light. The daguerreotype is actually, I feel, a remarkable technology. De Guerre's method relied on copper plates, coated on one face with highly reflective buffed silver and chemically primed for exposure in sensitizing boxes filled with iodine and bromine. Once a daguerreotypist ensured a given plate was receptive to light, they would insert it into the camera for exposure. After a lengthy exposure period, as we know, 3 to 30 minutes, which made sitting for portraits incredibly difficult, the plate would be ready for developing. This was done with the help of hot gaseous mercury. The photographer would then immerse it in a fixing solution. In a fixing solution, wash it, and usually tone it with gold chloride before setting it in a suitable viewing case or frame. So one of the benefits of this process was that the image was captured directly upon a solid reflective surface such as copper or buffed silver. This meant that it actually had a remarkably high resolution, to use a modern term. This amount of detail made the technology very popular and was by far the most popular photographic medium in its native France, as well as America, even after newer technologies were developed. So then after de Guerre's announcement, Talbot, who had been continuing to work on the Calotype for a number of years, began working even harder to perfect this technology and to try and get rid of the head start that de Guerre had got. And in 1841, he revealed the Calotype. What separated the Calotype from the daguerreotype, and why Talbot is regarded as the inventor of photography, is that the daguerreotype created a positive photograph on a copper plate, meaning no reproductions could be made from it. The Calotype, on the other hand, was the first ever negative to positive process, as can be seen in this slide. This meant that it created a paper-based negative image that could be used to create positive reproductions of the image. One significant difference was that the Calotype needed far less potentially deadly chemicals in its development. As I'm sure, as I read the daguerreotype process to you, if you notice a number of red flags such as bromine and mercury. Both of these chemicals are known to be rather poisonous, if not completely deadly. So Talbot's Calotype, while by no means safe, used much less overtly deadly chemicals. And both of these, but still, both of the processes were very difficult and labor intensive, and meant that the photographer needed to be quite well versed in chemistry before contemplating a career in photography. In the 1850s, a new process came along called the wet collodion process. It was invented by Frederick Scott Archer, and with this process, a syrupy, light-sensitive liquid named collodion was used to coat glass plates. This collodion was made with gun cotton, a commercially available product, which was ordinary cotton, but had been soaked in nitric and sulfuric acid and was then dried. The photographer then dissolved this gun cotton in a mixture of alcohol, ether, and potassium iodide, which was then poured from the beaker with one hand onto a perfectly cleaned glass plate, which was continuously and steadily tilted with the other hand, quickly distributed and even coated. When the collodion had set but not dried, this was in a matter of seconds, this plate had to be sensitized by bathing it in a solution of silver nitrate, which combined with the potassium iodide in the collodion to produce light-sensitive silver iodide. After being placed in a holder, the plate was then placed in a camera for exposure, which while still wet, hence the identification of the process as wet. All the stages needed to be done while the chemicals were still wet, otherwise they would turn inert if it dried, which did mean that the process was rather time sensitive, and rather difficult because of that. So while all of this upheaval was occurring with regards to the development of photographic processes, how is this affecting the actual taking of photographs? To explore this, we are once again going to go to the early days of photography, back to when William Talbot was photographing the boulevards in Paris. This is one of his most famous images, and he described it thus. Please excuse my terrible French pronunciations. This view was taken from the upper windows of the Hôtel de Double, situated at the corner of Rue de la Paix. The spectator is looking to the northeast. The time is the afternoon. The sun is just quitting the range of buildings adorned with columns. Its facade is already in the shade, but a single shutter standing open projects far enough forward to catch a gleam of sunshine. The weather is hot and dusty, and they have just been watering the road, which has produced two broad bands of shade upon it, which unite in the foreground. Because, the road being partially under repair, as is seen from two wheelbarrows, the watering machines have been compelled to cross to the other side. By the roadside, a row of citadines and cabriolets are waiting, and a simple carriage stands in the distance a long way to the right. A whole forest of chimneys borders the horizon, for the instrument chronicles whatever it sees, and certainly would delineate a chimney pot or a chimney sweeper with the same impartiality as it would the Apollo of Belvedere. So what I think is important to grasp from this description is just how much a camera is capable of recording. It will record everything it is pointed at, and at a time when people were only just beginning to understand the medium, this was seen as more of a drawback than a benefit. Why this might be, I will explain. Well, the problem was twofold. Firstly, some of the photographers themselves resented this. Ian Jeffrey, the author of A Concise History of Photography, noted that for some early photographers, this meant that the instrument was only partially in control, or that the instrument was only partially under control, recording disinterestedly in spite of its operator's intentions. If this was the case, how could these photographers lay claim to being artists? This is an observation that has always, and probably will always, concern photographers who wish to be seen as more than just button pushers. If a painter or a sculptor is in such control of their medium, what of the artists? What is the artist that cedes a fair portion of the process to the magic that happens inside of a box? Jeffries then notes a second concern that came from the medium's irreverent indiscriminacy. If the creators themselves were perturbed by this ability, how would the viewer of the image react? He goes on to say, expecting a view of Paris, the photographic audience finds instead a scene to be deciphered, a matter of road repairs, hot weather, water carts, cabriolets, and a mysterious solitary carriage. Such pictures as that of the boulevards of Paris demand careful attention, raise question after question, and settle very little. To complicate this even further, the public at the time were more used to seeing beautifully composed and realized paintings. These paintings could be argued showed the world how it was supposed to look, while the indiscriminate medium of photography tended to show the world as it was. Well, more so than the paintings perhaps, but that is an argument for another day. Let's just say that the public were not quite ready for such a disrespectful medium, and so documentary style photography accounts for a remarkably small amount of early photography. This is not to say that there was no documentary style photography, as there were early pioneers such as Hippolyte Bayard, who created stunning Parisian cityscapes such as this one. I feel it could be argued that his style was so well composed and edited that he managed to avoid much of the fascinating irrelevancies that so tortured other pioneers. These other pioneers instead focused on more socially acceptable subject matters such as still lifes, seascapes, and trees. Those so many trees, as can be seen from this page. But now we'd like to look at a single tree. This one is a photograph by a photographer named, a French pioneer photographer, captured in Egypt in 1851. His name was Félix Thénard, and it illustrates how from the earliest days of photography, there was an intrinsic desire to capture the exotic. So while it has been argued that John Thomson is one of the first travel photographers, it is quite obvious that Thénard both traveled and photographed years before Thomson did. I feel there is a distinction to be made between the bodies of work, though. Thénard was by profession a civil engineer and by nature an academic, and this becomes apparent when viewing his intensely focused and severe work. While traveling more than 1,000 miles up the Nile River, amidst a region of great exoticism and wondrous landscapes, and populated by the peoples of Egypt and Nubia, he photographed nothing but architecture and riverside palm trees. Well, this is certainly partly because he was using the Calotype process and would have been hampered by the exposure times. It is also because, unlike a travel photographer, he wasn't particularly interested in conveying an experience to his viewers, but instead wanted to document. And document he did, creating an imposing 32-volume collection of exotic architecture few people outside of Egypt would ever have seen. Then came the game changer. As I mentioned earlier, this is the wet collodion process. This greatly shortened exposure times. Even William Talbot celebrated this development, writing to a fellow photographer to tell him how images were now able to be created in seconds, sometimes as little as a single second. Finally, the age of instantaneous photography was upon us. In 1855, John Dillon Llewellyn won a silver medal at the Exposition Universelle in Paris for being one of the first photographers to ever capture rolling waves and fixing instantaneously the floating smoke and steam of a steamboat, as can be seen in this picture. So yes, I mean, the wet collodion process really added a new stage in photography, and this is when Thomson started coming into the world. But before Thomson did, one more person. So if Tenacht might not have been Thomson's spiritual forebear, the next man I'm going to mention might very well be. Francis Frith was born in Chesterfield, England, and was a partner in a successful wholesale grocery business before becoming interested in photography. In the early 1950s, as the wet collodion process gained popularity, he embraced this more instantaneous style of photography, and I feel really pushed not only the boundaries of the medium, but of how photography was accepted as an art form. Like Tenacht, he also traveled widely through the Middle East and Northern Africa, and at first glance, Frith would seem to be very much in the tradition of Tenacht. As like Tenacht, he spent much time photographing architecture and monuments, but for Frith, he believed in more than just the cut stone and clean lines of the architecture around him. Frith was more interested in showing his audience what his travels felt like, the experience of the journey, and in this sense, he is much more in tune with what we would today call a travel photographer. His images are populated by people, as you can see in this image, and the people sit or stand amongst statues and monuments, and in one of his images, the riverbank is even occupied by a Nile crocodile. What I think is also important is that Frith opened up the foreground of the image in a way that was quite unusual for the time. For the early photographic pioneers, they seemed to be more focused on documenting an object or a thing, and so the foreground was less important. For Tenacht, the architecture was his focus, and so the entire image was devoted to this. For Frith, on the other hand, it was the immersive experience he was trying to convey, and an open foreground is essential in allowing the viewer to imagine the path, not only into the picture, but into the experience. In this image, he even used a path of footprints to lead us towards the pyramid. So as Ian Jeffrey says in his book, above all, he wanted to give the feel of things, to show just what it was like to be there, on just those roads, amongst just those rocks. It must be noted that at this point, photographic technology was little over 20 years old. And the struggle of photography was not just learning how to use cumbersome, ever-changing equipment, but it was also about dealing with a strangely contradictory public, who were both enthusiastic and skeptical of this new medium. And so, by the late 1850s, photographers had developed, at least partially, a pictorial code to help the public engage with their images. And again, I think Frith is a good example of this. As I mentioned earlier, Frith was one of a growing number of photographers to populate their images, and this had a number of reasons. Well, this was done for a number of reasons and had a number of effects. Firstly, it allowed a sense of scale to be developed, but also it allowed a focus point for the viewer to center their experience. Added to this, the small figures generally placed amongst large buildings or a vast landscape added to the awe of the image. This was particularly evident in Frith's work, and I feel quite evident in this image of the pyramids. And when you combine this with Frith's use of the foreground to invite the viewer into his images, you begin to realize how much more aware of the medium these photographers were when compared to Fox Talbot and his realization of the fascinating irrelevancies that his first images used to capture. So this was the world that Thomson found himself in when he finished his apprenticeship at an optical and scientific instrument manufacturer and decided to become a photographer.
Hi, John. Sorry to interrupt you. Some people are having some issues with the sound. Would you mind trying to speak up a little bit?
I will try and speak up with this.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. Yeah, so this was the world that Thomson found himself in when he finished his apprenticeship at an optical and scientific instrument manufacturer and decided to become a photographer. He found a public that was becoming increasingly accepting of the photographic medium, particularly since photographers were beginning to use the digital frameworks that the public found encouraging. Importantly, though, he also found a technology that, while cumbersome, was surprisingly useful for the work he wanted to do. Exposure times were generally measured in seconds, and this allowed for formal portraits that had previously been incredibly difficult. What he particularly liked was that he could not only create negatives and so could reproduce his images, but with the invention of glass plate negatives, he could create negatives of high clarity. In fact, he so liked the wet collodion technology that he continued using it even after much more convenient dry plate technology was invented. But this is not to say that the wet plate technology was all fun and games. As previously mentioned, the wet plate collodion process required the photographer to move with an entire darkroom and a full complement of equipment. Here is an image of the mobile darkroom used by Roger Fenton while photographing the Crimean War. So, I mean, at the best of times, this would be difficult, but can you imagine trying to move through a 19th century battlefield or the sweltering jungles and waterways of Siam with all of this equipment? To get a better grasp of what this would have been like, let us explore what this actually meant for Thomson. While in Siam, Thomson undertook a voyage from Bangkok to Siem Reap to photograph the ruins there. According to Google Maps, today this journey might take us about 6 hours by car. It took Thomson an entire month. He used 4 different means of transport, including riverboats, buffalo wagons, and elephants, and he needed 6 staff to accompany him, including 4 people purely to manage his photographic equipment. This is explained when you hear what his equipment consisted of. Thomson's darkroom was a 3-sided tent constructed of 2 thicknesses of black cloth held up by a tripod of bamboo. It had 1 small window which was covered by yellow cloth to provide safe illumination. Added to this, he needed to carry a full complement of very fragile lenses and glass plates, as well as chemicals and trays. And on top of all of this would have been a number of cameras, each of which was a cubic meter in size and made from heavy hardwood. So, now that you're aware of how complicated it was being a photographer in the 19th century, let's take a walk into the Siam exhibition together. We enter into the first of its 2 rooms and are greeted by a wonderful introductory space. There are neon lights and the saffron orange of Monk's Roads dominates the room. It may sound a bit like a nightclub, but I think it's actually very tastefully designed. And it's impossible not to notice the size of the exhibition prints. These prints are large, even by modern standards. Yet, despite being made with almost 160-year-old technology, they have a remarkable clarity. That is the power of the wet collodion process, and the reason why Thomson liked the process so much. But then when you take a step closer, you begin to notice the blemishes. These giant prints are festooned in scratches and cracks, and many have included the negative edges within the print. Some prints are even signed, and some have inscribed borders. In a way, these prints have the modern feel of a Jim Goldberg Polaroid, but the subject matter is quite obviously from the distant past. Immediately to the right as you walk into the gallery is a portrait of King Mongkut. He is adorned in the traditional robes that you as a viewer might expect the subject of an ethnographic study to be wearing. So you begin to fall back into the comfort of seeing colonial photography playing to ethnographical time. But then you look to your right once more, and you see King Mongkut once again, yet this time he is dressed in a Western military uniform. He is no longer a royal from a far-off exotic land. He teaches on understandability in a way that very few subjects of colonial photography in the 19th century do. This is the power of John Thomson's work, but more particularly, it is the power of his work displayed in this exhibition. You see, one of the interesting aspects of this exhibition, and the many international ones that have come before it since 2013, is that these images are being displayed in a way that Thomson himself would never have even imagined. For one thing, up until possibly 30 years ago, these images would never have been able to be seen at this size. The photographic processes that Thomson worked with, the wet collodion process, only allowed contact prints to be made. And this was a process whereby the negative was placed directly upon the paper it was to be printed upon, meaning it was impossible to make the print any larger than the negative itself. The public viewer in his day would have been lucky to see the image at half the original size, as while Thomson's work might have been exhibited at full size and was published in a number of high-quality, large-scale photographic books, these would have been exceedingly expensive and out of reach of most at the time. Your average citizen would need to have bought one of Thomson's carte de visite, a small print that would be quite similar to today's postcard. It almost feels redundant to say that the viewing of an image of that kind of image would differ tremendously from what we're lucky to experience with these exhibition prints. In all honesty, though, it's very unlikely that Thomson, sorry, before we get to that, this is just a quick representation of the size, the scale difference between the two. The smaller image would have been a representative of the 8x10 negative he would have worked with, and then the larger image is representative of the 1.5 meter long print that we have up in the exhibition. In all honesty, though, it is very likely that John Thomson would not even have approved of the way his images have been displayed. You see, all those beautiful cracks, blemishes, and patches of missing collodion that I feel add so much interest to the prints. Thomson's imagery would always be retouched before publication, thus removing evidence of the collodion process, and instead cultivating a smooth veneer that stressed the documentary transparency of the medium. So why do I mention these two topics? I feel this is an important entry point in discussing how Thomson's work is viewed in our current context. Thomson's photographs were rediscovered, one could say, when Betty Yao, the managing director at the Prudential International Arts Management, encountered them while visiting the Wellcome Library in London. The Wellcome Library had had the wonderful foresight to create high-resolution scans from more than 650 glass plate negatives. When Yao saw these scans, she reportedly fell in love. And not surprisingly, as the captivatingly detailed digital scans of Thomson's plates adds a fascinatingly modern aspect to the already engrossing subject matter. But you may ask, why would Betty Yao have chosen to display these images in this way rather than as the neatly edited versions Thomson would probably have preferred? I obviously cannot speak on behalf of Yao, but I can give my own opinions. So firstly, in a sense, I feel that the stripping away of the transparency of the photographic medium allows one to be more aware of the processes that took place to create the image that we're currently looking at. Suddenly, we're much more aware that these images were created using the fascinating wet collodion process. We as viewers are allowed to fetishize these prints as objects rather than just the carriers of information. Secondly, it should be recognized that this is a good example of what Marshall McLuhan meant when he coined the phrase, "the medium is the message." As the medium of engagement changes, so too can the information being conveyed, sometimes even drastically. In this instance, instead of exhibiting the photographs as Thomson would have, cropped, edited, and situated within the colonial anthropological framework of the times, we're able to see through these processes and can view the images in a very different light. So what do these unvarnished images allow us to see that its edited images would not? As I have stated previously, it's impossible to look past just the sheer size and clarity of the images. Merely increasing the size of the images means that we as viewers are able to see small details, the fascinating irrelevancies, as Willcox once called them, that escape Thomson's otherwise exacting composition and editing skills. Let's have a closer look at these two images of the Royal Barge. In this image, it's the rear half of the barge, or the engine room, so to speak. With this image, perhaps when we look a bit closer, perhaps the surroundings are not hugely illuminating. I find the roofs particularly interesting, but the added resolution doesn't add much to this. But then, when we're able to go in even a bit closer, suddenly things change a bit. We're able to examine the faces of the barge's oarsmen. With these modern digital scans and prints, we're able to see the individuals, and not just their faces. We can see their chest muscles and their uniforms, and even how they wear these uniforms, details that would have been largely invisible to all except those with the most powerful magnifying glasses in the past. Then, this image I find particularly interesting. Once again, we're able to see the faces and clothes, but particularly wondrous for me are the details of this incredibly ornate barge. The dragon's faces and the engravings on the boat are, I think, quite wonderful. But these are not entirely fascinating irrelevancies, as they are probably the focus of the image. So let's look a little bit beyond that. And you can see that the boat in the background, I'm quite drawn to that. It's blurred, so it was obviously not posing for Thomson's camera, and it's just people that are sort of navigating their everyday lives on the waterway of Siam. But then if you look even a little bit closer, you're struck by the spectators in the background. Were they attracted by the Royal Barge that particular day, or do they generally sit and watch life go by on the waterways of Siam? And what is the structure that they're sitting in front of? Is it a shop? Is it a restaurant? That workshop? Is it a workshop? I mean, it obviously has stuff piled up in front, maybe for sale, maybe just for easy access. These are details that would have largely been lost to Thomson's immediate audience, and I feel we are greatly richer for our access to them, as these change the image from being images representing the beautiful craftsmanship of the barge and the ceremony of its use into images that also indicate what life was like for everyday Siamese citizens. Also indicates how, as viewers, we are more educated into photographers and into photographs, and how we aren't as put off by these irrelevancies as people once were. But beyond the scale and clarity of the images, what else can we gain from looking at Thomson's naked negatives? Firstly, let us look at a few images in the way Thomson chose to display them. To do this, we'll need to look at this fascinating portrait of King Mongkut one more time. And for this one, we have three separate images. We have the original negative scanned, then we have a scanned print that survived from Thomson's time, and a woodcut engraving that was used in a French newspaper. I would like to first look at the woodcut adaptation of Thomson's image that was used in a French newspaper. At this point, while it was possible to make prints from the negatives, and even include these prints in publications, newspapers did not do this. It was too much work for them to do. So they instead chose to have an engraver make a woodcut print from the photograph and then use this to make many quick reproductions for their publication. This image is probably the earliest published photograph by Thomson, and it is quite illustrative of how images were used in that period. With this image, there is condensing of information. Anything extraneous, such as the background and the carpet, were removed. What is left is the exotic, the metal ornaments, the ornate chair, and King Mongkut in his ceremonial robes. Importantly, he is not named in the accompanying text and is referred to as the King of Siam. This, it can be argued, denies King Mongkut his personality or his individuality and boils the image down to representation of his role rather than of him as a person. The next image is very obviously the scanned negative, but I want to look at it in comparison to the surviving print from Thomson's collection. When you compare these two images, it's possible to see how much editing has been carried out. Most prominent is the cropping of the edges. The wet collodion process is difficult to apply the collodion evenly across the whole plate, and so edges were often quite uneven. One can also see how sanitized the center of the image is, and while one can assume that the ravages of time will have degraded the negative and undoubtedly added some scratches, the reality of these of how the negatives were made and transported in those days would have meant that the scratches would still have been quite numerous even then. So, in preparing for this talk, I read a fascinating essay written by Willcox in the journal Photo Researcher. His essay spoke about how the scanning and redisplaying of these images allows for us as viewers to find new meanings in them, like I had mentioned. But to further illustrate this topic, I'd like to read you his following quote. The means of photographic reproduction are evidenced both by the presence of blemishes and attest to the fraught and delicate materiality of the technology. And through the negative's frequent inclusion of the mise-en-scene of photography, the visual noise that points to the contingent, constructed and negotiated nature of the photographed event. We are thus given a more nuanced perspective on the photographer's limited authorial and imperial authority, and a more sympathetic picture of cross-cultural relations than Thomson, as an ambitious ethnographer and swashbuckling geographer, actually intended to display. In focusing on the aesthetics of the negative, we find a way of reading imperial photography against the grain. So I've been very hesitant to drag this talk into a discussion of John Thomson and ethnography. I personally find it quite a fraught topic, and to be honest, given how much has been said on the topic, I don't feel that there's much that I could bring to it that is new. So it was with great joy that I found Willcox writing, as it reinforced a thread that I'd been picking at on my journey through Thomson's work. Thomson was definitely a photographer with an ethnographic tendency in his work. It would have been impossible for him not to have that, given the time that he was working. Yet he was also an exceptionally talented photographer who was able to conquer cumbersome equipment and massive geographical distances to create memorable images. And he was also able to build strong bonds with his subjects across cultural divides, and so create images that are nuanced, and even after 160 years, they're still worth looking at and learning from. So I think we're quite lucky today that we're able to look at his work through a more modern lens, as it were. And because of this, we're able to move away from the systems that his work was created within and view it in a new and less constrained light. And that is the end of my talk. I'd like to thank you all for logging in today. A special thanks to Laura Muldowney and the Wellcome Library, and I want you all to just know or remember that you can access all of Thomson's images from his Asian travels on the Wellcome Collections website. The link is here on my slide. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks so much, John. That was great. Really enjoyed that.
I hope the sound wasn't too much of an issue. I was worried about
it. Definitely improved when you put the microphone up to your mouth. No, that was great. Does anyone have any questions for John or me? The other thing to say is, I don't know if you've noticed from our website, but the exhibition, very luckily, has extended until the 3rd of January. So you'll have ample time, hopefully, to come in and take a look at the photographs again. It's such a pity that it closed when it did. So great news that it's continuing to stay open for several more months. I see here that there are a couple questions. Was Thomson related to the Thomson Travel Company? No, it's a different spelling. Thomson is Thomson. Will this exhibition be available to see for long after the CBL opens? Yes, it will be open until the 3rd of January. So hopefully, I know at the moment we're due to open to the public on the 20th of July. Hopefully that will happen. So that gives us a good few months. Yeah, when will the Chester Beatty reopen to the public? Hopefully the 20th of July. You probably can't answer this, but how would those people have stayed still on a boat for so long? John.
I mean, it was obviously posed, but actually, if you look closely in certain areas, some of them are blurred, so they weren't able to stay completely still on the boat. But also, given that it was outside and in broad sunlight, it probably would have only been a second or two exposure, which, I mean, yeah, they were able to pull it off. And I'm sure you noticed I spent a bit of time on those photos because I really find them quite fascinating.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm just seeing if there are any more questions. Oh, actually, one thing I did want to say was in the exhibition, there's a portrait of Prince Chulalongkorn, who would be the next king, King Rama VI. And there's a stand. You can't really see it very well, but at the bottom of his feet is a kind of a circular disc, and there's a stand going up his back, and there's kind of a clasp on his neck to minimize his movement. So yeah, I don't know how the people in the boat managed to stay.
Well, I think that portrait would have been taken inside, so there would have been a lot less light.
Yeah.
Available.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so a couple more. One person said, my first webinar, fascinating, thank you so much. It says, what do you know of his end? I saw his house by the river. People say he just disappeared. I don't know about that. I think he died of a heart attack, actually, in 1921. Oh. I'm interested in the fact that he was a white man with colonial power, etc. And you said we can now look beyond this. I'm interested in this. Can you expand?
Well, yes, I mean, but basically, like I said, it's more a case of looking at being able to divorce the images themselves from the context that they were created in. I mean, you're obviously not able to divorce them entirely from the context, and they do still carry a certain amount of weight in that sense. I would hesitate to get into it too deeply, but I could try and email you that very fascinating essay that I read, which speaks directly to this topic. So, I mean, maybe if you
want to type your email in the chat, then we could
or in the Q&A, which I think would just come to us. Then I can email that essay to you, which I find fascinating.
I think I'll answer one more question before we sign off. Thomson must have been a diplomat as much as a photographer. How did he gain the access to the royal household? Well, I know that he did contact someone when he arrived in Bangkok in September. of 1865, he contacted someone in the British consulate requesting to photograph the palace. And in fact, not only was he allowed to photograph the palace, but he was given permission by King Mongkut to photograph himself and some of the members of his family and officials. So yes, I'd say he probably was quite diplomatic and probably quite charming.
Yeah, I mean, a lot has been made that he was a very charming individual,
Yeah.
and who could talk his way into, well, into friendships with these people, which to a certain extent does also add to the, one of the reasons why perhaps he could have broken slightly through the colonial, the more colonial aspect of it all. But yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, I think we'll close there. Thank you very much for coming. And I should have looked this up. I'm not sure when our next virtual talk is, but it would be on our website under What's On. So thanks again for coming, and we hope to see you in person very soon. Thanks very much.
Thank
Bye.
you so much, everyone.
Bye.